this topic because, as like I say, this is not the kind of thing that you are going to find on HGTV or your Pinterest pages or anything. We're going to delve into kind of the ugly side of gardening today. I do kind of want to qualify that a little bit and say, I am not a plant pathologist. I'm a horticulturalist. So plant pathologist really studies infectious disease organisms and environmental strains on plants, whereas my background is more what I call generalized jack of all trades and the care and culture of it. But like I said, I think this is a very big, challenging, and important topic. And so my way of presenting it is I'm really going to highlight three different profile three different diseases. Not because really it's important to get the specifics on there, but I think they really illustrate sort of the concepts of disease control and disease management that we're talking about. Also do want to take your questions. I'm expecting lots of questions because there's always lots of questions surrounding plant diseases and how to manage them. So with that, are we all set, Sally? Am I ready to go with my pictures? All right, away we go. Okay, so what you're looking at right here is a very common, very widespread disease. It's just called powdery mildew. Easy to recognize, and I'm sure you're seeing this out in your garden. Affects a broad number of plants that's in there. So in that little screen, I'm looking at powdery mildew on Monarda or bee balm. This little image, I'm looking at powdery mildew that occurs in turf grass. Powdery mildew on zinnias. So again, you're going to find this in perennials, turf, annuals, powdery mildew on the euonymus, trees, shrubs, vegetables. Like I said, this is pretty much a ubiquitous disease, and you're out there finding it at this time of year in your gardens. The pathogen itself, it is a fungal pathogen. And the way this works is it becomes infectious at temperatures of about 70 to 85 degrees. So the disease organism, the powdery mildew spore, is out there in the environment. But what happens again is when we have this combination of moderate temperatures and high humidity, that's when it becomes infectious. So I'm trying to show my little pictures here. This is what powdery mildew looks like on euonymus. I took this picture about 1 week ago, so this is all current stuff. And then this is a microscopic image of the spores that are produced. So again, these are so tiny and microscopic that they will move in the wind. They'll move with splashing water. So mildew is so widespread because it easily disperses, like I said, through the wind and through the through splashing water, and it sits there, basically it sits there in the environment on the leaf surface, and it's just in this kind of dormant condition. When we hit the combination of moderate temperatures, that 70, 85 degree temperature range, and high humidity, like we always seem to encounter in June, then within days, you'll see this kind of outbreak occur. So that's kind of gives you an idea of how these diseases spread and how they migrate, because the first thing I always hear from people is, where did it come from? I've never had this before. I've never seen it before. All those kind of things. I said, well, you've just been lucky up until now, because I try to explain, even if you sanitized your backyard, these spores are moving about in the wind and the air, and it's only a matter of time before they show up. Powdery mildew is also kind of interesting in the disease world, or when we're talking about fungi, because most of these fungi actually require wet conditions to infect the plant. Powdery mildew, it's even inhibited a little bit by a wet leaf surface, but when we get just high humidity, that's when it sets in. So those of us that are here in the Northern Virginia region know that 75, 85, high humidity conditions, kind of stagnant air is a very, very common situation. So to put this in terms of kind of concepts of disease, plant diseases and how we manage them, there's this classic example that goes out that we talk about disease triangle. There's three different conditions that need to exist at the same place in the same time to actually have a disease outbreak. So one leg of this triangle, or you could think of it a three-legged stool, is a susceptible host. So that, in this case, is the host plant. As we talked about it, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different plants, everything from, crepe myrtles and dogwoods and cucumbers and squash and lawns and trees and shrubs and flowers like phlox and monarda, and the list goes on, are susceptible hosts. So the plant, the susceptible host, that leg of the triangle is there. The pathogen, in this case, the powdery mildew, these spores are common, they're widespread, they disperse in the wind and through the air, so they're present. And what happens, as I've said a few times, it's when the environment changes. When I say a favorable environment, an environment that's favorable for a disease outbreak. And with this case, it's that 70 to 85 degrees and the high humidity. When we hit those conditions, when those three components arrive together, boom, mildew shows up. So that's where it's coming from. It's not, I guess it can be introduced with plants and stuff, but this is just a part of it goes with gardening. And I keep saying that I have so many new gardeners, and this is such wonderful to invite and bring new people into gardening, but dealing with diseases, dealing with insects, dealing with environmental stresses, this is all a part of the gardening experience. It doesn't mean you're a failure. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It's a part of the experience. It's what I've been doing for the last 30 years of my life, is dealing with all these issues. So again, I'm kind of getting a little too focused on. So what do we do? How can we manage these problems? Our first line of defense always is and always will be what I call our cultural controls. Think of this again as that three-legged stool. And if I can take away any one of those three legs, then I broke the triangle. I was able to prevent and stop disease. So number one, I talked about having a susceptible host plant. So just simply in terms of selecting the plants, knowing which plants are susceptible to mildew or not, using varieties that growers have developed that show greater resistance to it. If I change my plant selection, then I can have a change in the outcome of these disease problems. I call sanitation. Anything I can do to clean up the presence of these spores. I said, hey, that's a tough one to deal with because the spores are kind of always there, everywhere. Even like I said, if I go through and I remove the diseased infected leaves and I clean up my area, eventually a disease like powdery mildew will be reintroduced by your neighboring properties or something. But again, to the extent we can, cleaning up the area by removing infected plants, removing debris from the garden may help to reduce some of the presence of the disease. Good air circulation, because I emphasize that powdery mildew needs high humidity to infect the plant. So anything that helps to improve air circulation through there, that helps to maintain better or lower the relative humidity or dry out faster, can also help to reduce the disease. So we're trying to adapt the environment so that we're working on all three legs of that stool together to try to stop disease. And then the other, which I put in there, accepts the situation. As I go through this, more and more years I spend on, I really think the way we're going to work around this is also to change our expectations of it. Mildew, for example, is not a deadly serious disease. It infects the leaf, it causes spots, it causes blemishes, it gets moldy. Those leaves may actually shed, but it doesn't really kill plants. So a lot of this comes down to what you can accept. And I know I speak with many of you at the clinic, and I might tell you my way of saying it is the plant can live with this. The plant can tolerate it, but the question is, how much can you tolerate? And I understand this. If you're trying to grow roses and you want beautiful roses to plant in a flower, for flower arrangement to bring in a vase, then you are not going to be accepting of mildew. But that is an important part of the equation. What can I accept and manage in our gardens? So that's kind of my little intro to this. and we'll also say that, you know, this thing with gardening, with nature, it will always keep you on your toes. The world around us is constantly changing, constantly evolving, adapting. And I was thinking about this a little bit with this dogwoods. You can go out and look at your dogwoods. Quite possibly you'll find mildew on them right now, this time. 20, 25, 27 years ago, there was no mildew on dogwoods. When I first started seeing it, I was researching, trying to find out what do we do to control, manage. Why am I finding mildew on dogwoods? Well, there was absolutely no reference to mildew on dogwoods. And when I called the pathology lab to find out about, their responses, well, dogwoods don't get mildew. Over time, what we found is, so the powdery mildew develops different strains. It mutates, different strains develop. And so this was a mutation or a strain of mildew that infects dogwood. So when we talk about mildew, I emphasize that's a group of pathogens. And so a mildew that's affecting your rose will be different from the mildew that's affecting your cucumber, will be different from the mildew that's affecting your dogwood. And this kind of changes is a constantly evolving process. I keep thinking it hasn't been shown yet, but like I've never seen mildew on peonies until about 10, 14, 15 years ago. Now we see it all the time. My guess, I mean, I don't know, is that this is just going to be a different strain of mildew. And yes, this conversation reminds me very much of what a lot of us are experiencing and learning as we go through kind of the COVID pandemic. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, because I think it really is in the front of everybody's mind about how pathogens spread, how they move, how they change to different strains, and how we use different practices, you know, to try to manage it. I'm going to go through this again, switching gears. Downy mildew is a completely different, unrelated pathogen. They just got stuck with similar names. Downy mildew frequently occurs on the underside of the leaf, whereas you saw the powdery mildew occurs on the top of the leaf. Powdery mildew that we were talking about, that spreads and disperses by spores on the wind, downy mildew expresses and disperses by spores in the water. They're actually in a different kingdom. When I was in high school and even early parts of college, there were two kingdoms, right? There's a plant and an animal kingdom. Well, now they're debating whether there's 6, 7, or 8 different kingdoms. And the protista, which is where the downy mildews live, is more closely related to algae. Their spores actually have a little flagella. They swim, they move, and they migrate. So I think this starts to bring in how the information keeps changing. We kind of have to stay on top of it. And this also greatly affects how we're going to manage the pathogens. Again, sweet basil, right? Everybody, you know, including me, you know, just, I don't know how I can really live without basil. Several years ago, we start seeing this mildew, this downy mildew attacking our basil. When it first showed up, I was sitting here saying, oh, well, that's not a big problem because downy mildew is spread by water in cool, wet conditions. When the summer heat arrives and things start to get warmer, this problem will go away. But it didn't. This was a different strain of mildew that's specific to basil plants. And one of the things that I saw right away is it remains active even under warmer temperatures. So this is pretty aggressive. And when I start talking about our disease triangle and our management options and everything, well, my acceptance level on this is 0. You know, I don't have any alternatives. You know, there's many different varieties of basil, but in my taste, in my cookbook, you know, it's like, hey, only the sweet Genovese basil will do. So I can't do that, and I can't compromise on it. And this stuff, because it destroys the leaves, and that's the edible part of the plant, becomes a pretty serious problem. And it will develop this kind of purplish gray moldy look on the underside of the leaf if you start to see that. Well, what happens, we're kind of in that situation as a high cash crop. And again, I look at sort of what are our control options that are available. So over the time, pretty recently, I think really just beginning in 2019, the first varieties of disease-resistant basil came out. The science has gotten better on being able to do these kind of genetic analysis and screening of the possible resistance that goes in that. So the plant breeders and the scientists, when the value, the economic value is there, they can really start to make things happen fast. So you have a disease that I can't remember exactly, maybe this gets introduced somewhere, I want to say like in the early 2000s, or actually like even later than that. And then within about 3 years, we start getting resistant varieties on the market. So anyway, I'm probably getting a little carried away here, but again, it's the same thing. We can remove the diseased leaves with good sanitation, but here's the other is downy mildew, these spores can persist for like 5 years or more. So once these spores get into the soil, they get onto surfaces and everything, they're persistent, it's there. And as soon as the warm, wet weather conditions occur, it shows up again. So yeah, this is a Basil. And let me say right now, we are sold out on it. So this is like future reference, not today reference. But a Basil was this new hybrid that was developed in 2019, where it's not quite the same. It has a heavier leaf texture, a more pungent flavor to it. It's propagated vegetatively, so that means it costs more. But this was, I grew a Basil and have been for the last couple years. This is the one plant, this just one plant growing one pot. It grows into this giant shrub. It's so productive and everything. It doesn't flower quite as much. So I was able to take this, cut it back, get one harvest of pesto out of it. It would regrow, and get a second harvest. It would regrow, and even get up to 3 cuttings out of it. So this is how I think we're really going to start to overcome some of these disease problems, is with the use of resistant varieties. Now, the other option that's available to us, we always work with our cultural things of resistant varieties, cleanliness, good air circulation, all those kind of things, always our first line of defense. But where that lets down, where it doesn't provide us sufficient control, where it's exceeding our level of acceptance, and where we feel like we need to step in and do something, that's where fungicides come into the picture. So understand what fungicides are, is they are applied to the plant, and then they disrupt some type of metabolic function in the fungi that prevent the disease from being able to infect the plant. So fungicides are way, 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 way more effective if they're put on as a preventative measure. So what you learn is over time, if I sit here and, for example, if I'm growing a dogwood we had mentioned, and I know that in June, the temperatures are going to be in that 75, 85, the humidity's going up, I'm kind of aware of the forecast, then I can go out there and I can put a fungicide on there to prevent it from becoming infected. Now, when it comes down to choosing which fungicide to use, there's many good ones. I just brought these in for kind of show and tell. I'll show you a couple right here. So this one for, I got to switch screens, don't I? Still learning to do this. I do a stop share. So when we switch back there, so like daconil, for example, daconil is what we call a contact fungicide. So is copper. You spray it onto the plant. It's this sort of protective cover or barrier on the leaf surface, and it remains effective for like 7 to 10 days. 7 to 10 days goes by, and then its effectiveness is worn down. It has to be reapplied. So this is kind of why I emphasize this is a treatment, not a cure. There's also, you look at options like copper as a natural product. So a lot of people that are following organic gardening practices may choose to use copper, say on their tomatoes and squash and cucumbers and everything, whereas actually, daconil is labeled for those vegetables, but it falls into the chemical side. It's a chemical fungicide. So these are things that you need to take into consideration when you're actually making your choices. I also brought in as an example Infuse. This is an example of a systemic fungicide. Systemic fungicides are actually absorbed into the leaf surface. So that means that they last longer between applications. This might give you a anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks as far as control goes. And it can have a little bit of what we call a curative effect, or sometimes a kickback effect. But that really means that, okay, if I apply it within 1 or 2 days of seeing the disease, it can actually reverse that disease process by a day or two, but not significantly. And then one last little thing I'm going to put up here, and then I'm going to start taking some of your questions, is all the things I just showed you, those are fungicides. As I mentioned, like the water molds, things like the Downy Mildew, Pythium, Phytophthora, a lot of these fall within the disease category, but the fungicides don't control those. And if we're dealing with these water molds, then we go to something like this, this garden foss that's here. So all this is, I know it's confusing to a lot of you, that don't work with this, but the point that I'm really trying to get through to you is this is why it is so important that you get a good diagnosis. That's why we're here at the clinic, is to help you with that. So we get a good diagnosis, and then we can better understand what our options are as far as control goes. At this point, I'm going to stop talking for a minute, see if we have any questions, let you take a minute to talk. Any questions coming in, Sally?
Thanks, David. Yes, we do have questions coming in. Just want to let everybody know, I'm going to start with the questions that are a little bit more directly related to the fungicides and the different products. And then for those of you who are asking about specific plants, if we have time, like that are in your garden, we'll get to those. If we don't get to those, just remember you can always follow up with us after the class. If you're on Facebook, either send us a message or go to our webpage and fill out the contact us box. If you are on Zoom, you can hit reply to any of your confirmation emails, and that'll send an email to me. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. We have a question about wildlife and insects and the impact of these products on those. So if someone is looking to kill or deal with the mildew, how do these products affect bees and butterflies? Can you use systemic products, or is there something else you should use?
So very good question. That's why I keep emphasizing, really, to me, the answer is, hey, selecting varieties, using our cultural controls, learning to live and tolerate with this. I look at fungicides as my sort of absolute last resort. And the bottom line is, I think what we're realizing is we don't really know. A lot of research is being done and started looking at the impact of some of the systemic insecticides on pollinators. And one of the things that they discovered is kind of, it's like anything, you dig in and you start opening new questions, because in traditional orchards, for example, there's a lot of fungicide use that goes on to growing and producing fruit, and they rely a lot on bees as pollinators for that. And they're discovering that actually when they start doing analysis of the pollen and the honey that's found in some of these hives, the amount of fungicide that they're taking back to them is significant. And so a lot of that there is now being reevaluated to look at in terms of, so what is the impact of that on the pollinators? So it's a very good question. That what I can tell you is the conventional thinking is, hey, these are fungicides. They go after metabolic pathways that occur in fungi and don't occur in insects and mammals. But having said that, I think all that is under closer evaluation. So right now I'm just saying, hey, let's use all our best cultural controls. Let's try to avoid the use of fungicides. Where they do come in, where we're using them as a last resort, let's be cautious about it. Is really, I think, the best way I can answer that.
Okay. To follow up on that, if you're having issues with fruits and vegetables, anything that you would be eating, can you use a systemic product on that? You said it was absorbed into the leaves.
So they are labeled. Some of these are labeled for use on fruits and vegetables. And on the label, they will give you precautions of the time between application and time of harvest. So again, you have to look at it. We have a lot of trouble, for example, with rust this year. Rust is a fungal disease. You see it on apples and pears, predominantly. Lots of pear rust out this spring. So if you're trying to manage that disease, there's a fungicide called Immunox which is systemic. And when I say systemic, it penetrates into the leaf surface. But there's still a time interval we'd have to check between application and harvest. Again, a lot of people are uncomfortable with this, which is why more of the organic options are out there. So things like copper and sulfur, for example, are natural products. They're used as fungicides. They're what we call biorational fungicides. There's a lot of move towards things that are more natural, lower risk, but the issue is they're not quite as effective either. So there's a trade-off that goes on there. Again, this is when I know you guys, when we're talking, I try to lay out all these options for you and let people make their own choices on it.
Definitely,
So
yeah.
always read and follow the label directions anytime I'm talking about these products.
Yeah. All right. So following up on the rust, we have someone who just wrote in saying they have a few ornamental pears that are having rust. Now the question is, they aren't able to spray. So if someone can't spray the fungicide, is there something that you would recommend using in place?
So this is a really good example. Great question. Because my answer is a couple things. Rust, it's a really interesting disease. Rust disease, they have what they call alternate host pathogens and everything. So, or alternate host plants. So when you look at your pear and you see what they call these little orange pustules coming out, these teleospores, they're releasing spores in the environment. They're dispersed by the wind, and they are going to go over and infect juniper trees. They're going to cause a gall on the juniper tree. And then next spring, the juniper tree is going to rupture into these orange looking spores. And then they're going to transfer that back to the apples and pears. So if you're going to treat rust on your pear tree, that needs to be done in April before you actually start to see symptoms. The other is, if I'm harvesting fruit, if rust gets into my, it's a pear that I'm growing for produce, that's a huge problem because it renders the fruit inedible. If it's rust that's entering into an ornamental pear and it's a little sterile or immature fruit that I don't intend to eat anyway, and all it can do is cause some little spots and blemishes on the leaf, I don't worry about. So that's an example of my guidance is just live with it. It's not really going to kill the tree. It causes spots, it causes blemishes. It's what I call a nuisance because I don't intend to eat the fruit anyway. So who cares if it gets full of rust disease? But if you want to treat it, your most effective treatment is a product called Immunox that's applied in April, right after it's finished blooming.
Got it. Okay. And this actually follows up on the preventative, getting out ahead of things, maybe. So one person has written in, they have an issue with myrtles. They have 7 different myrtles and it comes back, the mildew comes back every year and spreads to all of them really quickly. So can you get out ahead of mildew and spray in the same way? Will that have an effect? How do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that we're seeing a lot of, and that's why I keep trying. I think these are great because I want everybody to sort of understand the limitations we have with it. One of the, crepe myrtle, lots of wonderful, great things to say about. But one of the things that happens to crepe myrtle is that they are susceptible to mildew. So a lot of breeding programs, this was initiated down at the National Arboretum decades ago. A lot of the breeding programs are led to the development of more disease-resistant varieties of crepe myrtles. So the first thing I do is I would look for good disease resistance in there as one of the qualities I'd look for. But even if you're giving them good cultural control, hey, I'm using resistant varieties and I'm spreading them out, I have good air circulation, I'm doing all the right things. Around here, like we experienced about 7-10 days ago, when the temperatures go up and the humidity goes up, the disease pressures can overwhelm all this and you still have a disease problem. Again, none of us are really trained pathologists, but I look at my forecast today. Today's humidity is like something like 46%, and this life is grand and it's not infectious today. But 3 days from now, when our humidity goes back up to 70-80%, it goes back to being infectious. So it really comes and goes with the weather. My long-winded answer here is that you kind of know you have the history, you put it on your calendar, You know that the disease is going to show up when we start getting that, 70 to 80 degrees and the high humidity. When you see that coming, then yes, you kind of do a preemptive application of fungicide. That's really the only other tools that we have available to us. Scott, I know I'm giving long answers, but I think it's important you understand the whole concept behind this.
No, it's great. All right, so we've got a couple more questions, and I think we might have some time to get into some people's more specific questions. Here's a question about garden tools. I don't know if this relates specifically to the mildew or to plant diseases and issues in general, but do people need to clean their garden tools, and if so, how often?
Yes, let me ask you, Sal. I have my third disease is Boxwood Blight, which is actually transported and transmitted by tools.
Ah, well, this might be a good point to talk about that.
Do that or go with the questions?
Let's go ahead. Why don't we cover Boxwood Blight? I think that'll be of a lot of interest to people on the call.
Okay. So this is my 5-minute answer to simple, do I need to clean my tools kind of answer. But here we go. All right, so Boxwood Blight. This is just the third disease I wanted to profile as an example of how all these things we talk about fit together. So this was introduced, they first found it here down the Virginia, North Carolina state line, 2011. It's been present. It was a disease that existed in Europe, but accidentally got introduced here in 2011. And of course, boxwood, a treasured part of Virginia landscapes. These pathogens tend to be very plant specific. So this disease, it causes leaf spot in the boxwood, and it causes them to defoliate. Really, so it only goes after plants that are boxwood and its closely related relatives. So for us, this is boxwood, sarcococa, pachysandra. It's not going to go into hollies and azaleas or any of your other plants. So it's got a limited impact. But it causes, like you can see in the picture, causes spots and blemishes, and then all the leaves drop and fall to the ground, and that's not a very attractive boxwood. It can infect plants anywhere when temperatures are from a low of 68 to a high of about 85, but where it is really most aggressive, when I say optimum temperature, optimum for the disease, not for the plant, but it's right when we hang in there in that like 77 degrees and wet conditions. So what happens again is when the temperatures are hanging in that mid 70s and the leaf is staying wet for a prolonged period of time, when you see in the forecast, oh, it's going to be raining, chance of rain 4 times this week, afternoon showers, and a constant wetness. And we've had this happen to us, not so much this year, but in previous years, where even as we go into June, July, and August, which are normally dry months, the last few years, when we keep getting wet conditions and the warm temperatures coincide, then boom, this thing can show up. And you'll start to see the little purple spots that go on there. And then that pretty quickly engulfs the leaf to where it just turns this yellow-gray color and sheds off of the plant. If you're able to see along the twigs, there's little black cankers. So there's specific diagnostic things we look at. Back to the tool question. This I put in here because the way these spores are dispersed is really, they're what pathologists call sticky spores. They don't blow, they don't spread on the wind, but they get on your hands, they get on your clothing, they get on your feet. They can get on, if your animals run by, they can get on your fur, and they can get onto your tools. So back to the question about the tools, yes, you can transmit pathogens through the tools. It varies a lot on specifically what disease they are. But one of our management techniques that is so important with this disease, with boxwood blight particularly, is sanitizing our tools. So an example would be in this case, which is kind of most extreme, if I'm working on a plant, a boxwood that I know is infected, and let's say I'm pruning out some dead twigs, I'm cleaning it up, those spores can get on your tools, your hands, your feet. before you move on to boxwoods in the next part of your garden, if you're in the backyard, before you go to the front yard, clothing, tools, and everything needs to be sanitized. So usually when I talk about sanitizing tools, that's either going to be Lysol does a good work, or good job, or bleach works well, but they really need to be soaked for a few minutes. So it is a good idea to sanitize your tools whenever you know you've been around infected plants. And if in the case of like boxwood, then you want to be like really super aggressive on. If I'm pruning diseased plants, like there's some bacterial diseases, viral diseases that we're not even talking about, but viral diseases like rose rosette, when you cut an infected plant, that virus can get on your tools, and then you can go over the healthy rows and spread it. So yes, clean your tools. I would say, at least, at the beginning or end of each season, you should do that, just as a standard thing. And if you know that you're having disease problems or working around diseased plants, more frequently is probably the best way to say that. Now, anytime there's a new pathogen in a highly prized plant, it gets like emotional as well. And many, many things that I see coming into the clinic with, boxwood blight have been incorrectly diagnosed. Because, for example, this is Volutella blight. Looks very similar. Again, it affects boxwoods, but these are spores that are dispersed on the wind, and it's nowhere near as aggressive or infectious as the boxwood blight disease is. So again, I just keep emphasizing the value of getting a good diagnosis, because it'd be different treatments. Phytophthora, this is one of these water molds I talked about. It's not even related to fungi. This has been around forever. It's common as could be. It goes after boxwoods and wet conditions, again, that we talked about. And this is a serious pathogen. This kills plants also. I'm not trying to diminish it. But again, the way it spreads, the way it's managed, your cultural options, all that is completely different than if it's boxwood blight. This is a vascular disease that gets into the stems we're showing, and then that becomes, unless we catch that real early in the game, school's out for that. So with boxwood blight, it's the same idea as, hey, we're going to use at trying to work with disease-resistant plants. Sanitation, because again, with boxwood blight, these spores can be on the leaves that were diseased, so we don't want to leave those lying around. They need to be cleaned up, put in trash bags, disposed of. Even the ground around the plants cleaned up around them, tools cleaned up in there. This requires a wet leaf surface. So a lot of how we manage our irrigation, allowing the plant to dry out between watering, can help to reduce it. And again, the emphasis of the diagnosis. And as a last resort, we do have ways to treat boxwood blight, but this wears us down. Nobody, most of all me, I don't do any of this in my own garden. I preach it, but I don't spray diseases in my garden. If I have a disease problem, I either live with it or that plant gets replaced, because the last thing you're going to find me doing with my little bit of spare time is out there mixing, measuring, and spraying. But those are always options that are available to you. These are some new disease-resistant boxwoods that are out there. I just want to give a real quick heads up to let you know. Don't get too discouraged, because these are some new, they're showing disease resistance or disease tolerance because they don't have a lot of history out one. This one they call Little Missy. This we call New Gen, or Independence is a variety. The National Arboretum has an extensive program going on. They're doing like genetic evaluation. They've developed using computers with artificial intelligence to screen a lot of these varieties. So it's really amazing seeing a lot of the technology come to the forefront. So we're going to continue to have all these great plants in our landscape. I am not trying to be like a bummer and discourage you. I want you guys to be realistic and know that it is a part of gardening, and have a better understanding how to deal with it. So now I'm going to see if we can fit in a couple more questions before we have to sign out.
Thanks, David. Yeah. First question, and I apologize if you covered this because I was answering a question during part.
We're not listening, Sally.
I was typing. I'm sorry. I try to multitask, but sometimes I don't hear. Did you cover how precisely the tools should be cleaned? What's the method for it?
Yeah, so really the method, the best way is to soak them. I mean, obviously you're going to kind of clean any dirt or debris off of it. I'm thinking particularly like pruners, because that's one that could be a real problem for us. Those really, they should be soaked. I think it's for about even up to 5 minutes, soaked in a either Lysol or a bleach solution.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We just had a comment and said, remind folks not to add diseased cuttings to the compost pile. So,
Yes, there's, and now I'm going to say this is Fairfax County, but I know there's different jurisdictions, but there's an issue about where yard debris goes to the county recycling facility, but our extension agent met and worked with the county officials and stuff. If you have diseased plant material, invasive plants, things that do not need to go into the compost, you're supposed to be able to put them out in the household trash, and it is the policy to pick those up and dispose of them with the trash, not put them back into the municipal mulch pile.
okay, well, that's probably good. All right, let's see. So here's some other questions. And these are not necessarily related to the topics that we discussed, but we've got a few minutes. So the first question is, do you have any recommendations for early tomato blight?
So we do all our cultural stuff. We talked about, trying to, spread the plants out. So blight is, again, it's a water mold. It spreads by water and splashing water. It's in the soil, it splashes onto plants. So anything we can do to kind of keep the area clean and dry, which means spreading your plants out, watering the soil, not the leaves so much, keeping a layer of mulch to reduce splashing, all that is going to be our very first lines of defense that goes on there. Again, sometimes we get into where it's just constant rain, warm conditions, and the plants get overwhelmed. If blight starts to show up or you have a history of it, what is most effective is Daconil is the most effective treatment for it. Again, this is a conventional sort of chemical fungicide. Not everybody wants to use this in their vegetable gardening. I get it. But in terms of what works, this is going to be your best control, and it's sprayed on the plant. If you want to go something kind of what I'm going to call in between, copper is a natural product. It's approved for use in organic gardening. You can spray it on your tomatoes. We may get some suppression of blight, but it doesn't give quite the same effectiveness as something like the Daconil does.
Thanks, David. The next question is, what do you recommend for scale on a lemon tree?
Scale, again, that's insect. What works really well in those is a horticultural oil. Again, the oils, you spray it on, you have to do this outdoors. I mean, you can do it on tropical plants, but you actually have to do it outside.
Take the plant outside.
Yeah, it's a highly refined petroleum oil. There's nothing super toxic about it. But basically, you're spraying the plant along the stems, the branches, top of the leaf, bottom of the leaf, doing good thorough coverage. That oil basically goes into the little breathing pores and suffocates and desiccates the insects. You may have to do it a couple times because you never get complete success your first go round, but you do this 2-3 times, spray it, wait 10-14 days, spray it again, wait 10-14 days, spray it again. 2 or 3 applications usually takes care of it.
Thanks, David. All right, we just have 2 questions left, so we'll keep going. This is from someone who has an apple tree that took cicada damage. If they cut back all the damage, they'll be lopping off most of the limbs, and the tree will have a trunk with maybe 5-inch limbs and nothing else. Can they wrap the limbs to support them with something to give them a chance to heal? Is their apple tree finished?
My thing is just kind of wait and see. What happens is you are going to lose quite a few twigs in there. You're probably going to lose some productivity, but not every branch is going to die. Where she lays her eggs, depending on just how extensive the scarring is, the size and weight of the branch, et cetera, some of those wounds will seal up, or they don't really heal, but they seal themselves up, as some of them are going to snap and come off in the wind. So I would be patient, wait and see what happens. Over the next few weeks, you're going to find a lot of dead twigs, dead branches. The stuff that's actually dead, yes, you'll prune that out. The other branches, it may be just doing a little bit of gradual thinning over the period of the next 2 or 3 years, rather than having to cut them all back at once. But hey, you got another 17 years before you have to worry about it again. So it's disappointing to fruit tree growers this year, but the trees will recover. You'll have some damage, and then, you know, life goes on from there.
Sorry, I was muted because my dog started barking. All right, all right, last question is, what do you recommend for black spot?
Black spot is going to be the same deal, where you're always looking for disease-resistant varieties. I'm not a rose expert, but we have people that kind of guide you towards some of the better varieties out there. Black spot, again, is kind of a warm, moist condition. And so if you're really trying to grow beautiful roses, you kind of end up having to do the fungicide kind of routine. We've got a number of different products rather than trying to rattle off a bunch of chemical names, but you're probably going to have to do preventative treatments starting oftentimes around May. You know, definitely is by the time you get to June with a little bit warmer, moisture conditions that are in there. But I would want to quickly say, because we're talking about roses, everybody knows roses get insects, disease, virus, they're high maintenance plant. But roses, apples, pears, peaches, plums, cherries, these are all plants in the rose family. They're all susceptible to rust, mildew, scab, you know, black spot, the list goes on. So a lot of this just comes with knowledge and understanding what you're planting, what you're growing, and if you're going to grow those, what kind of commitment it takes. So I'm known sometimes the anti-sales person. If you're going to undertake growing home fruit, for example, you've made a big commitment that's in there, and I'd love to talk to you, because maybe buying it at your local farm market's not such a bad deal.
Thank you, David. All right, everybody.
Are you asking questions?
That's it. That's all the questions we have for today, and we are out of time. So just want to remind everybody, if anything comes up after class, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll be emailing me if you're on Zoom. Either send us a Facebook message or reach out to us through our contact us page if you're on Facebook. We'll be forwarding your questions on to David to have a look at. So we're happy to follow up with you. David, thank you so much for covering this topic today.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.